Kyoto, Osaka, Vancouver, Mexico City, and more. It's Notebook on Cities and Culture Season 3, kickstarting on Friday, December 14th. Keep your eyes on colinmarshall.org for more information. This episode of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Janus Dialogues, focusing on how emerging trends are impacting and will impact marketing, particularly the experience marketing industry. Visit the site, share a story or two, and follow Janus Dialogues on social media. That's Janus Dialogues, Janus Dialogues.com. Season 2 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. First heard about your book when I saw you on a panel. I forget what it was even about at the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books, and you said something that struck me as kind of memorable. You said some events in life made you realize that your former dream, your writerly dream of drinking with famous dead authors in bars in the middle of the night was no longer a good dream. What did that mean exactly?
I do remember that panel. It was about like sort of the internet, I guess, and sort of the future of journalism on the internet. And I think that what I meant was that, I guess, when I was younger, I had this idea that being a writer would be a lot of hanging out and a lot of talking about literature, and that there would be no sort of like, that this sort of problem that everyone is having right now between platforms wouldn't exist, and that as a writer that you could just sort of ignore all of that and just sort of scribble out prose, and that it would be picked up and then processed, and then you would be famous. And I guess like now it just involves a lot more hustle, and I think in some ways that's good. You know, it rewards people who work hard, and it sort of takes out what used to be a very hierarchical and elitist structure that would process that sort of stuff. And so now if you have like a Tumblr, or if you write something like, I don't like, even something like 50 Shades of Grey, where like that's just like sweat equity, I guess, that's turned into millions and millions of dollars. In that way, I guess it's good. But in sort of the grand, I guess, like Woody Allen, what was that movie called where he was doing about like Paris, and it had like Hemingway? It just came out last year.
Is Paris in the title? I think it is. Yeah. Paris, Midnight in Paris?
Midnight in Paris, yeah. That, I think that's sort of the dream that a lot of people had of being a writer, and it just doesn't seem like that happens so much anymore.
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting here in Sunset Triangle in Silver Lake in Los Angeles with Jay Caspian Kang, editor at the sports and pop culture site Grantland, and author of the new novel The Dead Do Not Improve, which takes place in San Francisco, where if you've been listening to the show for a while, for a little while, you've just heard a bunch of interviews from there, recorded there. But he's also lived in New York, and of course has lived here in Los Angeles. And before we talk about any of those places, I want to know, just sort of generationally speaking, is that everything you've described, is that something that writers our age tend to have a hard time dealing with? Like, it seems like specifically writers in their late 20s, early 30s struggle with their the opportunities that are now available to them as much as they embrace them. You know what I mean? It seems like for filmmakers or for musicians or whatever who are around our age, they're pretty much cool with the way things are changing in those industries, and what they can do. Writers, some of them are, some of them aren't. I mean, do you think that assessment is even true? Well,
I think for fiction writers especially, and probably poets as well, although I don't know as many poets, like there's a certain mindset, and the glamour of it isn't, like it doesn't really exist as much anymore as it did how you sort of thought about it when you were growing up. And I think that I guess in that way, I think there's a ton of resistance to it. Like I know people who I went to graduate school with, people who I went to college with, who are fantastic writers, and in a lot of ways they're shorting themselves opportunities because they have a certain idea of what is like acceptable and dignified within the medium.
What are they not doing?
Well, some of them won't publish on the internet. Some of them will have a lot of trouble sort of being in any sort of publication except sort of the sort of grand library of literary reviews or like the New Yorker or something like that. And I think I do think that's a little counterproductive. I mean, I think it's a lot counterproductive, but I certainly see where they're coming from because, like, in the end, writing isn't going to make you that much money anyway, so you might as well hold on to sort of like a naive dignity while you're at it. But I do think writers in that way are a little bit different. Like, there's no filmmaker out there, young filmmaker out there who's like, if I can't like sign with Fox Searchlight or if I can't search with like MGM, then like this is all for nothing, but for writers, I think those sort of venerable old institutions still probably have a lot of sway.
Who were the writers who got you thinking about writing glamorously or unglamorously growing up?
I went through a lot of phases. I think they're very typical phases. I think when I was like 14 and 15, all I read a lot of like beatnik literature, which is why I was sort of drawn to San Francisco and writing a book about San Francisco. I think that I went through the sort of quasi-Buddhist phase with Salinger, Ezra Pound, all that sort of stuff that a lot of people go through in their adolescence. But I think more than anything, I was just like just one of those people who read all the time and was not interested in much except books. I think I read pretty much everything. I still remember I've read all like the L. Ron Hubbard science fiction books, and it wasn't because I knew who L. Ron Hubbard was, just because I read every science fiction book that was out there. So.
Are those any good? They've been kind of poisoned by Scientology now. And by the movie Battlefield Earth.
Yeah. They're very racy, and I think that's what I enjoyed about them as like a 16-year-old. So it's just like a lot of like porn on spaceships. And that's always good. So but still, obviously, I did have this idea that one day I would be in New York City, and my work would be processed in the same way that like John Cheever was processed or something like that. And that, now that I look back at it, like that's just like a crazy thought, but I think it is what a lot of writers my age or older grew up with, and I think that there's a lot of people now who are a little bit younger who like don't sort of hold on to that same sort of like 1950s sort of glamour about it.
When you have those sets of goals growing up, is New York City a destination? Like, I've got to go there. I mean, that's where I'm going, New York, if I'm a writer.
Yeah, I think everyone has that dream, right? Like you hang out with your friends and all your friends are well known and you're in like some sort of dimly lit bar with red leather booths and like there's like you're drinking like too much and you're talking about books and stuff like that.
Doing the kind of smoking only legal in Koreatown, at least in Los Angeles.
Exactly. Like you are smoking cigarettes and then at some point like you grab like a editorial assistant and then stagger home or something like that, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, there is a certain, you use the word dignity. I don't know. I guess there is a dignity to that. There's also an indignity. You think of the sort of Fitzgerald or Faulkner drunks. I mean, there's dark side to it as well, right?
Yeah, but I would say, that's most of the glamour, right? Like, the glamour is sort of this willful self-destruction and then being called by your editor, being like, listen, we need this short story, and you're like, I'm 6 months behind because I've been, me and so-and-so have been shooting guns in the backyard. Right. I don't know. I guess, like, that, I don't see that in New York, but I don't live in New York, and I don't really go to those sorts of parties, so maybe it still exists, but certainly it's something that I've since become very sort of resistant towards.
Right. It's funny because some of the subject matter, at least when you're writing journalism or nonfiction, a lot of the pieces that have gained a lot of resonance with readers seem to have been about race, and a lot of that crowd of writers is like they get slagged off as old white guys these days. How do you think about that? The fact that scene seems to be like old white dude centric, and you've thought so much about race for your writing. I mean, does that produce any thoughts in your mind?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's when I realized it was absurd. Like, that sort of dream was absurd, was that, like, what I was sort of idealizing was, like, a all-white group of guys. And, at the time that sort of dream existed, like, maybe I wouldn't be allowed in the bar that they were all at. And then, and then just sort of basic industry stuff, like, that you come across that everybody complains about and seems kind of trite, but it is true. Like, you know, like you are pigeonholed in a certain sort of way. You know, like I think people who are readers expect certain types of books out of certain types of demographics, you know, so it's really hard to write something that doesn't feel like you're sort of marginalizing yourself in a way, you know, and I always go back to this, but I do remember there's like that. I was reading some letter from David Foster Wallace to John Franzen, and they were talking about like tribal writers, and I was like, well, that's the problem, you know. It's like a guy like those guys who probably are the establishment here that everybody looks up to, and is like, well, that's like sort of a literary genius. Like even they can't really see past sort of the way that the publishing industry labels and sort of divides things. And I think that, you know, you just are faced with this choice of, are you going to play with that and have some sort of career, or are you not going to play with it and hope that everything goes okay, or are you going to sort of retreat to the internet where there is like more of a, where you can almost find an audience for anything, you know, and that you don't have to go through those avenues. And I guess I've done a bit of all of it, but I found that the most sincerely gratifying part for me, or the things that I found that I did, that I look back and I'm like, well, I'm really glad I did that and I'm proud of it, are the stuff that I put out on the internet that gained a large audience just by itself. And I feel like I had the least compromise in that, because I wasn't thinking about, you know, like, well, am I really just explaining this group of people to like a white audience, or am I trying to make the book like sort of about my experience as a minority, so that like a white person can read it and be like, oh, well, that's what this is about. Like there is just none of that, you know, like you can sort of cut through it. And I feel like in that way it becomes more honest, and I think that's why you feel more of a connection to the audience that you reach in that sort of way. You know, on the other hand, like, you know, like sometimes like you don't reach the same audience because it is just on the internet and you don't have the same broad appeal, and I guess that has its own issues.
I mean, there's no way any writer wants the burden of explaining a people, right? That's not... Nobody would find that a desirable use of their own writing, would they?
I think there are a lot of writers who do that, though, you know, like, and I don't think that they're bad writers, and I certainly don't begrudge them what they're doing, but, you know, I feel like I guess I just get angry every time I feel like I'm being asked to do that by an editor or I understand the utility of it, but, you know, and it's something that I have done in the past where I've just been like, okay, like, it's more important that this piece is out and clear, but I certainly feel dirty every time I do it, and I don't think it's necessary really at this point, you know, like I think that people can fill in the gaps on their own, and I think that if someone really doesn't quite understand something, it's something that they should go out and research on their own, but I don't think it's the burden of the writer to be like, oh, well, you know, like this is exact for people who are not from this culture, like this is exactly what this means, because like that burden isn't placed on a lot of other writers, you know, like I don't think that in the corrections, like Jonathan Franzen has to like explain like exactly what sort of Midwestern suburban blight or like Midwestern suburban angst is about, you know. He doesn't have to be like, well, because these people came and settled in these factory towns and now the jobs are leaving, you know, and like people are in depressed economic times and the kids have no opportunity, and they sort of like wallow around in like the liberal academy or something like that. That's why they're like that. Like it's all sort of assumed, and I think that you can write like that, and as a minority from any sort of demographic, and people will get it. It's just that I think that there's a resistance, or that the sort of fear of not getting it is what guides a lot of what's going on now.
Coming up, how did you balance the one fascination with the dead white guy American writers, and then the other, which you've written about, with hip-hop, with the Wu-Tang Clan, with the iconography thereof? I mean, doing that all in North Carolina as well.
Oh, I think that's just a product of how old I am. I'm 32. And I think that I talk about, I don't even know if this is true or not, or this is just what we say, but I think that I sort of was, I think if you're around your early 30s, it was like, and you grew up listening to hip-hop, it was like sort of the last time that hip-hop was like sort of dangerous, I guess, to people's parents,
sure.
you know, so I think...
Now the parents have listened to hip-hop themselves.
Yeah, and there's just nothing, you know, it's just part of pop music now. And so when I was like a rebellious kid growing up, that's what me and my friends would listen to. And I think that a lot of it, my friends in high school were all Jewish. I was like Asian, and we were at this big high school in North Carolina. I think that it was a way that we sort of dealt with otherness within that high school, you know, like it would have been hard for them to like take up Saul Bellow or Woody Allen or something like that and still seem like they were doing something meaningful. And I guess the accessible way to show like, you know, like, oh, there's still an identity here, like we might fall out, we might feel alienated, but like here's this like expression of like alienated people that's like awesome and very tough and like masculine that and we got totally wrapped up into it. I mean, I think it was the only thing I was interested in for about all 4 years in high school, pretty much.
Right.
Yeah.
For people our age, even if we didn't actively listen to hip-hop growing up, you can't write about our lives and not mention hip-hop the same way you can't not use Simpsons quotes. You have your character talk about that in the book, in the same way we can't not write about the internet. I mean, what else can we not write about if we're writing about our own generation, in America anyway?
I think you can. I think I wanted the main character's brain to be filled with sort of the trash that I thought, or not even trash, but sort of the things that I thought anyone growing up in that situation would mostly be preoccupied with, and sort of the reference points that he would put in. So if you're like a nerdy Asian kid who grows up in this environment in North Carolina, you know, I think that you would be into hip-hop, and I think that you would be into Simpsons and sort of other things that are emblematic of the times. And I don't know, I guess I did have this sort of, I did feel, I don't think I'm supposed to say things like this, but like I did feel like as I'm supposed to say, like the character has his own life and everything is like, you know, of its own world. But I did feel a generational pressure when writing this book. Like I wanted to write something that would resonate with people who are about my age. And I wanted the characters to sort of exist with reference points that didn't need to be explained. And so that the experience of reading it would be like almost talking to somebody that you knew who had grown up similarly to yourself. And that's sort of like what I wanted Philip's voice to be like. Like I wanted him and myself to like sort of be conversant in the same things, because most of the people that I know who are my age like are all conversant in the same exact things. And for some reason I think that like, you know, the tent poles around which we sort of built our consciousness and the references are like a lot smaller than kids these days. Like I think kids these days, because of the internet, can go into any sort of direction. Like they can really get into anything. Like I remember when I was teaching high school like a few years ago in San Francisco, like the kids were into like almost any type of music that you could possibly think of. Like they
from any era? Yeah,
from any era. So like there were kids who were into the hip-hop that I listened to, you know, and I would see them in the hall and they'd be playing this stuff on their phone or something like that. I'd be like, this is, you know, like they're almost of like, they can be of any era possible, but, you know, I don't think that was possible for me. Like, you know, like unless I really dug in and was like trying to find African Bambaataa records or trying to go back and like get really into jazz or something like that. It just took a lot more effort, and
we would still be digging crates. We could learn about the things on the internet, but to hear them, we'd have to go hit the street. They don't have to. Kids exactly. These days, let me tell you.
Well, they're very. I mean, it's always I'm jealous. I wish I had that access, you know. But
we don't realize growing up that we heard adults say, you know, kids these days, but they were jealous too, in some sense. They weren't just complaining about us.
Yeah, exactly. Like, oh man, they can go to the CD store and get whatever CD. But I guess like it would be like it's something I'll never do. But I am interested to see like what sort of the loud novel of the kids who are like 14 years old now will like sort of sound like, you know, like what it'll be like. Because I don't think it's any of these TV shows that are supposed to be like Girls, or I like that show is fine, but I don't, you know, like I feel like that's more my generation. Like I feel like Lena Dunham or like she sort of exists within the space I exist. Like she doesn't have this sort of like very branched, varied, and really sort of almost scattered consciousness about that show. And I think that, I don't know, when those sorts of things come out, I'm going to be very interested to read them.
You know, you mentioned that you at the beginning we talked about the abandonment of the dream of hanging out in the red leather bar with the dead riders, and Lena Dunham seems to have a similar sensibility of like, well, we're going to put specific dreams behind us, but still have aspirations. I mean, there's something in our generation that seems like we have abandoned a lot of aspirations, but we still aspire a lot, just in a vague way. How to make this not so vague? I see a little bit of it in Philip Kim, your main character, who he seems to have like this core of aspiration within him, but he also works at a scam breakup consultation site. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's getting a little vague here, but
I think I do. I think that maybe this is just me, but I just feel like in literature right now, it's harder to be like true to yourself artist, I guess. And I think that what the aspirations of most people are, you know, a lot of ways, including myself, like are really scattered. Like I don't really know, you know, like I can't tell you what I'll do in like 3 years, but I think that if I had been born 10 years earlier and this book had come out 10 years earlier, I would have been set on a path and be like, I'm going to write my second novel, write my third novel. But now just like there's so many opportunities that might not even be opportunities, and there's so many different outlets that, and all of them seem to be like pretty good ideas that could end up with a good result, that that sometimes is a little bit paralyzing, you know? Like I think I guess like Lena Dunham specifically, I think she probably always wanted to be a filmmaker, and now she's a filmmaker, but you know, she's doing all this other stuff because like there's a brand that people associate with her that they want to get rich on. And I guess that is one thing that I constantly think about. I'm really bad at it, and I think that some people I will say, I do think this generation, I think that people like about my age and above don't quite get it. Like I work with a lot of 26-year-olds, a lot of 25-year-olds at Grantland, and just knowing them from the internet, and they're much more conscious that they themselves are like a brand, right, that they can sort of sell and do things that still are good and that still have like artistic integrity, but the only way to sort of dispense that and to have any sort of life with them is to make yourself into a brand. And right, and a lot of that actually, and the creation of that, I think, is actually based almost entirely on volume of output.
Really?
Yeah, like I think it is. Like I think that you have to constantly be relevant. Like you constantly have to be in the public eye. Like if you're like, I just find like on our own website, for example, like Grantland, the writers who do well are the writers who sort of see their following grow, are the writers who write almost every day. And I think that's true with almost everything, you know, like you just have to have a certain consistency of output so that the public knows that you're around and will keep putting things out and can build expectations. That's sort of how you build your brand as a writer these days. Like it's very difficult for a writer to work for 10 years on a novel, put it out, and then it's like a huge hit, and then they become, you know, like they stay within the public consciousness. Like things sort of cycle through much, much quicker, and you just have to always be around.
It seems like writers have always said you have to write every day, and now it's just like you have to write every day, but also people are going to see it that day.
Yeah, you have to publish every day.
Right, publish every day.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a chilling thought to somebody who's, you know, a couple generations above us, certainly. It's not so bad to people our age, but it seems like you've got to care about output and volume of output, and also to some extent you have to not care about form, no matter what artistic area you're working in. Like maybe you grow up wanting to be a filmmaker, but you know, when you were 10 years old, if you're around our age, the venues your films could play in most of them didn't exist when you were 10, you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, you have to branch out a lot. Like I think that you can, you know, that's why writers and comedians all have podcasts now. I think that's why every fiction writer I know pretty much is trying to get a TV deal. You know, like, I think that's why every writer has a blog and a Twitter, right? Like, it's not because I feel like the reaction against those sorts of things is always like, oh, well, who would care? And, 90% of people who do those sorts of things don't care. They just realize, I think, at some point that you have to build audience through different measures, and that you have to do it quickly and you have to do it consistently. And if that's just having like a funny Twitter or something like that between, magazine features or something like that, then that works too, But, it's certainly very, 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 very diametrically opposed to that vision of writers hanging out and putting out a novel every 8 years that will be celebrated. I don't know if people can. I just don't know if people can do that anymore. I certainly can't. Maybe the people who say that that'll be sort of the death of the written word and sort of the way that we know it. Maybe that's a better argument than something like, oh, Amazon will kill it, or distribution will kill it. I actually think it's sort of the speeding up of the writing and publishing process, and the way that people now read a lot differently, where you have to engage, especially on the internet. I guess I've just found being a editor and sort of helping steward this sort of big website, and having met a lot of internet writers, you just have to. The internet is idea-based, it's not craft-based. You have to have good ideas in your piece, and you have to state them very clearly. And that's much more important than narrative. And I think that you have started to see other forms of media, including journalism and stuff like that, sort of mimic that formula. And, I don't think that necessarily means that everything is bad, but I just think that that you're not going to find the beautifully crafted essay or the beautifully crafted long-form narrative journalism quite as much. It'll be very idea-based. And I guess it already is. I'm not sure.
So when you do make the mental gear shift to write this long-form narrative, the novel that did not improve, what made you... At what stage did it become a novel of San Francisco?
It was always about San Francisco. I mean, I was living there at the time when I started writing it, and I wanted to write something that I thought would be funny. I read some of the reactions where they feel like it's a real skewering of certain San Francisco types, and I don't really. I guess I just I never saw it that way. I just wanted it to be sort of hyper real, and I wanted the characters to be familiar, and I think that. I just don't think that the people are that far, the characters in the novel are that far removed from how people actually are in San Francisco. I love San Francisco. I love being there, but, there's this sort of, ridiculous self-righteousness and sort of self-pleasedness. I don't know if that's a word. I don't think that's a word. But, smug...
Self-satisfaction?
Yeah, self-satisfaction that comes with just having lived in that city. People I know are... who are there, who work in the tech field, they're not, they are literally the most consumerist people I've ever met. Their conversations, when you talk to them, it's all about different types of food, it's about different types of bikes, it's about different types of...
fleeces. Yeah,
fleeces, it's about different types of technology, and that there's no conversation that goes outside of that. And yet, within... And I don't think that's a particularly bad way to live, but I do think that it's silly when that's sort of buoyed up with this idea, because you are of San Francisco, that you also are a political thinker, that you're also a very introspective person, and that you also are advanced in issues progressive in issues of race and fairness. It's just you just hang out with white friends and fucking talk about food all day long. You're doing nothing, you're doing absolutely nothing.
Probably going backwards.
Yeah, and it's their contribution through their work is purely corporate. There's if you work for Facebook, you're working for a multinational gigantic corporation. And there's nothing small and boutique about it anymore. You're not sitting in a dorm room with Mark Zuckerberg trying to screw up the Harvard guys. You are the Harvard guys. And so I think that annoyed the shit out of me when I was living there. That sort of mentality, and I was thinking, well, it'd be really funny if I wrote a book where like a lot of these people get killed, you know.
Sure.
And so I guess it was like I always loved Flannery O'Connor. Like I always like, you know, I love the meanness of it, and so I don't know. I guess like that. I wanted to write a novel that sort of paid homage to that sort of meanness.
It also seems like there's a divide that opens up in the book, and in between the main characters. There's some of them are like that, like you've described. They're kind of new in San Francisco, but they draw a lot of their personal energy from just the mere fact of living there. And there's the people who are new in town. The main character Philip among them, relatively new compared to Philip says he moved there because of the Summer of Love, and then you've got people who moved there because of that, many decades too late, and then the actual Summer of Love people who seem to have some resentment. It's sort of the earlier San Francisco generation and then the later one. Is that a divide you see or saw in that city?
Yeah, definitely. I think that if you walk around the hate, you just sort of see it. And that if you talk to anyone who's lived in San Francisco a long time, they have a much grittier take on the city than sort of the younger people who live there. But everything is still encompassed in that idea that San Francisco is this progressive city by the bay, and that it's the most civilized city in the world, and that like there's no racism in San Francisco, you know, and all that I think is sort of a legacy of everything that you grow up, if you're a transplant, looking at San Francisco through, you know. So like for me, when I moved there, I'd never lived there before, and it was all stuff, you know, it was everything, it was all that beatnik stuff, you know, it was all the stuff that followed, all sort of like the 60s literature. It was all the, you know, it was like Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. It was like all that stuff. Even if that didn't happen in San Francisco, like, you know, I think Ken Kesey was mostly in Oregon, like, you know, you still associate it with San Francisco, and you believe that the city in itself is like this wonderful place, but really like the city itself is like you know, like it's really dirty. Like it's the most segregated city I think in California. Like you never see African American people. They all live, you know, like really completely secluded to like Hunters Point and Bayview. You know, like they're just these like horrific things where the police will not police Dolores Park at all, where thousands of white people go to drink out in public and smoke pot. But if you're a Mexican and you're sitting out in a park in a Mexican neighborhood, the police will like come down and bust your ass. And there's like no awareness of this, I think, within the typical San Francisco person who lives there, and that they believe that because and I think the reason why there's not that awareness of it is because they take for granted that because this is San Francisco that things are okay. You know, that the city doesn't have this huge heroin problem that they walk by every single day when they walk by, like, the BART station on 24th and Mission or 16th and Mission.
Yes.
And that, like, there is, like, this sort of divide that builds up, and that, like, the self-satisfaction comes from, like, the history of San Francisco, not so much, like, those people's actions or even the reality of the city.
Right. The experience of living in San Francisco seems like a harrowing one in the book for both Philip Kim and the other main character, the cop Sid Finch. But Finch has lived there a bit longer. He's older. He seems to look a little more kindly on the city just because he has more history in it.
Finch, yeah, I think Finch is like... I met a lot of guys like Finch when I was surfing, like guys who lived in San Francisco for years, and... you know, like they had their own narrative of the city, and they were very nostalgic about the way the city used to be, you know? And I think that with Finch, like that's sort of what he's almost living in, that past of the San Francisco of the 80s when he was a kid. Like when there was a lot less money there, like when that 60s generation was starting to get old and sort of decrepit, and like where like those sorts of dreams had fully fallen through, and then the city had to figure out what identity it was, you know. And like those guys, I think they're like working class people, like they're not from particularly wealthy families, and you know, like if more than anything they're sort of into sports, you know, like they're really into the Niners, they're really into the Giants. And I think that population of San Francisco, which is a lot of San Francisco, is really never represented, you know, like sort of this working class Mexican, working class white population of people who actually make up the majority of the city and own most of the houses. And really the discussion of San Francisco is either like you're 60 years old or you're like 24 years old, you know?
You're either end of the spectrum.
Yeah, either end of the spectrum, yeah.
Since we've brought up Finch, the surfing cop, I mean, there's one thing that caught me off guard in the book. Finch goes surfing. He runs into Chris Isaak on the beach. Chris Isaak is a character in the book. How did he become that? A cameo, but, you know.
Chris, I don't know if he does anymore, but Chris Isaak surfed Ocean Beach a lot. Like, he, I think after he became very famous, I don't know what happened to him specifically, but I think he's one of those guys who tried to find his way through. I guess when you're that famous and you're that rich and you're that good looking, you know, like, there must be a real meaninglessness that sets in once the rush is over.
Yeah, speaking of paralysis, totally.
And a lot of people try and find that through surfing. Like, I don't know, if you watch the Metallica documentary, which also takes place in San Francisco, like Some Kind of Monster, you know, like Kirk Hammett, who's Metallica's lead guitarist, he surfs all the time because he says, like, this is the only thing that will, like, reduce my ego. Like, it's the only thing that'll make me not drink all the time. It's the only thing that, like, makes me not feel like I'm, you know, like, part of this giant monster of Metallica. And, yeah, I don't know. I always, like, that was one of the 10 poles of nostalgia that I wanted to put in the book, where I feel like Chris Isaak's video with Helen Christensen was, like, you know, like, a lot, like, if every boy has, like, sort of this backlog and diary of masturbation, like, that's definitely in there if you're a certain age, you know. So, like, to have Finch actually interacting with Chris Isaak, I thought would be funny. I think the Chris Isaak, there are stories of him. Somebody wrote a lot about him surfing at Ocean Beach. I think it might have been in William Finnegan, who's now at the New Yorker. I remember, like, in 1990s, I don't remember this, but I've read it obviously since, but, like, you know, like, in the late 90s, he wrote, like, this epic 2-part piece in the New Yorker about surfing at Ocean Beach, which, honestly, now that I think about it, like, it's one of those things where you read, and if you're really into it, it's like one of my favorite pieces that I've ever read, but it's hard to think, like, why did that exist? Like, why did the editors of the New Yorker be like, okay, like, you know, they're only, like, back then, especially, there were, like, 80 dudes who surfed at Ocean Beach, and, like, all right, I'm gonna just write about one of them and do this long, like, 14,000 word piece on them. But I think some of the Chris Isaak stuff is in there. Yeah.
You know, Finch seems to use surfing as a way to, like, anchor himself. I don't know, to remind himself of what he really amounts to or who he really is. Philip, your other main character, seems, I mean, comparatively lost, at least. I mean, they both get into trouble in the book. They both struggle, but Philip starts out kind of floating in a void almost, right?
Yeah, he's, I think he's sort of one of these people who's lost on the internet, you know, that, like, there's existential issue that I think that he faces where he doesn't quite understand who he is unless he exists in some sort of print, because, you know, he's a writer. And I think that's sort of crushing thing, I think, is, I'm sure it's not, I don't think it's exclusive to people our age. I don't think it's generational. I just think that when you set out to be a writer and you get to be a certain age and you have nothing to show for it in terms of, like, except for, like, what you've done, you know, regardless of the quality, like, there's a certain loss that you feel. And I, you know, like, I the first 6 years when I was out of graduate school, I published nothing, and I think, you know, like, I certainly felt that, and, like, and, you know, you watch your other friends get famous and rich, well, not rich, but famous, and you start searching it out in other places, and I guess that's where Philip is at the beginning. Like, he's looking for anything on the internet that'll confirm that he's, like, sort of, that he exists.
And he gets pulled out of this oblivion a bit by a murder that happens in his neighborhood, and he gets some police attention put on him. And the book takes a turn that I really didn't expect, which is when he's getting questioned, when Philip is getting questioned by the cops. They bring up the fact that he jokingly put the two, I guess, in quotes, books, stories written by the Virginia Tech shooter on some profile somewhere, and the police do not look kindly on that, especially Detective Jim Kim, who's like Philip, Korean. And I'm reading this book, and these guys get into the conversation, and correct me if I'm wrong at all quoting this, but I'm paraphrasing anyway. The older detective says to Philip, or Philip says when he's thinking about it, he says, you know, we found out there was a school shooting at Virginia Tech. We found out the shooter was Asian, and then knew, not suspected, but knew immediately he had to have been Korean. And my Korean girlfriend was actually sleeping next to me as I read this part of the book, and I wanted to shake her awake and be like, "Is that true? Like, is that true? Like, do Korean Americans consider themselves as having advanced knowledge that he was one of their own, the Cho Sung-hwae?"
Well, did your girlfriend eventually answer the question?
I didn't wake her up. I was like, I'm going to let this one lie.
Yeah, I remember that very distinctly, and like I think it's one of those moments that I'll never forget, and it's certainly one of the things that I think helped, maybe not even help, but definitely sort of was a wake-up call, because I never would have thought before that. And I'm writing a piece now that I've been working on for a while for a magazine, and it's about that sort of moment of realization, and like, why did you realize that? Like, why? Like, I didn't.
How did you know?
Yeah, and like, what about? Because when I remember when I thought that way, it felt very foreign to me. Like, I didn't understand why I knew, And then through the last 5 years or so, like when you think about it, and a lot of sort of the introspection and thought that went into this novel, I think that there is a violence within the culture that you never really acknowledge, and I don't think that violence had anything to do with what happened to like one very deranged young kid who but I do think that is sort of what sparks you to almost identify that kid as your own. And I think even if he had ended up being Chinese or something like that, like I think that reaction still would have been interesting to me, and I still probably would have written about it. But yeah, I don't think that there's anything. I don't think that those things are causative. I just find that the two, and that when I've talked to a lot of my Korean American friends, they had the same exact reaction. Really? Yeah, and that
you have Philip say, "I knew the Japanese didn't have the balls, not the right kind of crazy. The Chinese weren't creative enough." Is that drawn from life, and to some extent, with as far as the reaction from Korean Americans?
Well, I think Philip is like Philip is probably a little bit less careful about what he says than I am. So like I think he. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like if you really sat down and talked to some people who are growing up in very typical Korean families, that they would tell you that there's, and like the kids who grew up here in Koreatown, like they even have words for it, like yeah, and that it's a part of the culture that is not really discussed outside of people within the culture, but it's certainly something that is like within the culture. Like you talk to people and they're like, oh yeah, well if you like typical Korean male anger problems, that sort of stuff. And I think that Virginia Tech was the first time where a lot of people had to just be like, holy shit, like maybe this life that we were living where we're trying to assimilate basically into white culture, like where we're going to really good schools, we're getting good jobs, and completely ignoring our cultural background, like completely ignoring anything that would make us different, and to the point where like we get offended when somebody posits that there's any sort of difference between people's culture, that just isn't going to work. That like it's not going to be, that is not like true at all. Like it's fine, like you can go to colleges, you can, I guess like it's just it was sort of like a slap in the face of this sort of race blind way of growing up and being like, well, I'm going to make a lot of money and I'm going to be successful, and then like I'm never going to have to think about this. Like you're going to have to think about it because things like Virginia Tech will happen.
Oh, I see. I mean, is that the main thing like that's happened? It seems like I'm trying to think of other high profile incidents with Korean Americans committing crimes. That's the only one I can think of.
Well, I mean, number one is the LA riots, right? Like the LA riots was like when, like that sort of built up the Korean mistrust towards the media because
they weren't really committing crimes though. They were just sort of trying not to get committed crimes on.
No, I mean that's not, like during the Los Angeles riots there's a lot of footage by the local news that showed Korean store owners that were with guns sort of in Watts, South Central, trying to defend their businesses, or maybe not even defend their business, maybe like kill people. And, like those people were tagged as vigilantes, and that it was not like a protective thing. And, from the Korean American perspective or from those store owners' perspectives, because the police didn't protect them, like the police would not protect Korean store owners and Korean businesses, which is why they're so disproportionately targeted. And I think that was like, you know, like, I'm sure there are others, but that's like still even more so than Virginia Tech, I think, is the main trauma in Korean American. Like in Korea America, to the point where like this year I think was the 10th anniversary 20th anniversary, right? And like there's just a lot of stuff put out, a lot of stuff written about how that had sort of transformed the way that Korean Americans lived here in this country. And I think that you still like, all my aunts grew up here in Los Angeles, all my cousins grew up here in Los Angeles. And the way that it shaped their lives, like where they decided to live, like where the boundaries of Koreatown are, like all of that is from the riots, you know?
Yeah, Koreatown, where I happen to live, it sort of moved north post-riots, did it not?
Yeah, because I think before it was down, like, I think there was a lot of presence down near Pico, like in Arlington Heights, and then, you know, like, those areas between the Watts riots and between the Rodney King Los Angeles riots, like they became completely abandoned. If you drive through them, like they're just beautiful, like 4,000 square foot craftsman houses down there that were all abandoned as like, you know, wealthier immigrant groups and sort of like the Jewish populations that were living there sort of fled north, and then I guess now it's starting to re-gentrify.
We talked earlier about the racial situation in San Francisco, and I wonder, do you consider it to be better or worse or just sort of differently bad in Los Angeles?
I don't know Los Angeles well enough. I will say this, I think my girlfriend and I really like living here because like we live in Eagle Rock, which is obviously like a sort of new cool neighborhood. But, you know, like we live around a lot of different types of people, and I guess I just appreciate that. Like, it's not something that I found ever in San Francisco. Like, in San Francisco, in the Mission, there are just blocks that are, like, young, professional, white blocks, you know? And that those might be next to, like, blocks where there's a lot of gang violence or something like that. But, like, this sense of segregation is still there, and I guess it's more in just sort of the way that people choose to where they go, you know? Like, there are Mexican bars in the Mission where people watch boxing, and then there are bars where like people are all wearing leather jackets and like you know, talking about bikes and stuff. So I always hated that about San Francisco. Like, I felt like it was, even within a very diverse neighborhood like the Mission, it felt very segregated. I don't think I guess Los Angeles is like that, but I feel like it's a little bit different. Like, every time I go to Koreatown, I see like different people in places in Koreatown, you know, like Thai Town, I guess, is now just like a restaurant district, but
some pretty good restaurants there, though.
Yeah, really good restaurants, and you know, like I really see it the most when I go play cards or something like that down in Commerce or like Bell Gardens, and that's where like you sort of just see like you know, like you have Armenian guys, you have Vietnamese guys, you have like Jewish guys, Israelis, everything sort of. And it just feels like there's so many different types of people here that maybe on a lot of lines the racial tension is much more intense and maybe even violent, but that like people are almost like okay with sharing space together. I don't know, but I've never lived on the west side, so I'm sure that's a completely different thing. But
probably I've never lived there either.
Yeah, you're on the east side, like It does seem like a little bit. Like we were looking for a while in Echo Park, and it seemed like that was like the first. You could never find a situation like that in San Francisco, I don't think, where you're like, I'm gonna settle down in this house, and it's a lot of like Mexican families and a lot of different, like some like Armenian families, and like I guess that just doesn't happen in San Francisco. San Francisco is so starkly segregated.
Given that, I have to bring it up. What did you think, if you saw it, of the film Crash?
Oh, yeah, that's like one of the worst movies ever, you know?
Okay,
like,
we're on the same page, I guess.
Yeah, like that's... I remember watching that with my jaw on the floor, man. This is the most offensive movie I think I've ever seen. Like, it's like...
Offensive or just kind of poorly thought through and not very well made? I mean, is it? Do you think it's actively offensive, or just happens to be because it's not... Because there's just not a lot to it, and it tries to be grander than it can be?
Well, I guess I just find that offensive. Like, where like some guy is like, I'm going to tell you what race is like, and then like the way that he paints things is so like so so like, it's not even dated, but it's just so like one note and basic. It's like, here's a white racist cop, you know, and like obviously the white racist cop in the end is going to subsume his racism and be the hero of the movie, you know, and then everybody else is exactly like a cartoon, you know, and the heroic story is actually that this racist guy doesn't become racist, you know, like, and that's like the great heroes, like that. It's just like, he's still racist, you know, like he just like didn't kill somebody, like it's not a big deal. I don't know, that movie is terrible.
Right. No, it's to get back to literature. Do you consider The Dead Did Not Improve to be? I mean, have you written a genre novel or a novel that uses genre to do other things? I kind of consider it the latter, but how do you think about it?
Having grown up with all those sort of literary ambitions and everything, like, and having gone to like, I guess this is another thing that you should never admit about yourself. I went to like a hoity-toity MFA program. Like, I never had any ambitions except for being like a literary fiction writer, but I couldn't figure out how to write a literary fiction novel that interested me, I guess, you know, and that I had found that like, while I still read a lot of things like that are a lot older that are, you know, deemed literary, that there's nothing that was modern that was particularly interesting to me, except for people who were sort of dealing with genre in an interesting way. And I wanted the book to be very readable more than anything. And so I just didn't want to write an intensely dense domestic book. And like I said, I wanted it to be funny and mean, and I guess like that's sort of how I came across the idea of writing crime novel, because I thought like if I could write a violent, mean, funny book, then that would reflect how I was feeling at the time. And so yeah, I think that's how I sort of was like, all right, well then all those elements would work well in a murder mystery.
Was the Korean reaction to Virginia Tech always a part of this book in your mind?
Yeah, for sure. Like I think that once I decided that Philip, the narrator, was going to be a Korean guy about my age, like I don't think that there is a way to build his interiority and his sort of thoughts of himself without discussing Virginia Tech, especially when it comes to like violence, which he encounters a lot in this book. Like I don't think there is a way that a Korean person who's like can really think about violence and killing and of himself as sort of, you know, like, and sort of think about himself and try and identify with somebody who's just killed somebody without thinking immediately of Cho Sung-hui and Virginia Tech.
Right. You mentioned the openness of Philip Kim, this character, and I'm thinking back, he does make a lot of admissions that narrators don't usually do. I mean, he talks a lot about the violence he feels within him, sort of barely contained. He struggles with that, and he has this interesting, like, idolatry of blonde women. What's going on with him there?
I think that was. I think he's very. I didn't want to write a. When I read some of the comments that have been written about the book, some people say that the character is not very likable, and I guess like for me that's like praise almost. Like I just feel like
you wanted him not to be.
I didn't want him to be immediately likable or heroic in any sort of way. Like like I said, like my favorite books, like the things that are like I love Proust. You know, I love sort of the endless interiority of it, and I think that when I started writing this book, I had been reading a lot of Proust, and I think that I wanted Philip to have that sort of endless honesty and interiority about it, and I guess like the challenge was, how do you fit all that interiority within a plot and not without having to write like a 7-volume, like 2,100 page novel, right? So I thought that if I just use a very standard crime plot, that it would work. I just didn't want anything to be uncovered or to be covered with him. Like I wanted everybody to sort of to understand exactly why he did everything that he did, or why he thinks he did everything that he did.
Now, how did you like using elements of the crime novel, of using cops and gunfire and thugs and not cults necessarily, maybe cults. It depends on what you want to call that bit of the underworld that's running through it. How did you Did you enjoy using those immediately, or did it take some getting used to, coming from MFA programs you did?
Well, that was the San Francisco element, right? Like, I think that San Francisco has this long history of crime literature, long history of crime movies that take, like murder mysteries, movies that take place there. And I wanted to build all of that in there because I did think that part of Philip's consciousness as being a transplant to San Francisco when he thought of San Francisco wouldn't just be like the Grateful Dead and the Beatniks and sort of hippie stuff, but it would also be Dirty Harry, it would be like Dashiell Hammett, you know, that there would be that sort of hard-boiled San Francisco cop, homicide detective would also be part of it. And so in that part, that was probably the most fun I had in the book was, you know, there are parts of the book that are just, there are lines in the book that are just lifted straight out of Dirty Harry or something like that. Yeah. So, and you know, that's not being lazy. It's really just the idea that, like, if your conception of living in a city comes almost directly from movies, and there are going to be parts where those movies intercede directly on how you experience how you're living, you know. Right.
You do use even more quotation of other media than that. Am I correct? I was reading that the chapter titles are usually or always quotes from Troy McClure of The Simpsons. Is that true?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Man, I gotta find one. I think I realized I had the faint notion that, like, I was recognizing some of these lines. I don't know which one is your favorite of the ones you've used, but it sort of dawned on me they might have come from somewhere else. And Dial M for Murderousness, you know, you may remember me from such films.
Yeah, they're all Troy McClure, who like is obviously Phil, one of the characters that Phil Hartman played on
one of my favorites, certainly.
Yeah, on The Simpsons, and that idea came really early, actually. Like, I remember reading a list of them on the internet. I was like, every single one of these is hilarious, and I couldn't remember every single episode that they happened in.
Right.
And I thought that it would it would play sort of a funny, unreal superstructure of the book, I guess. I mean, that feels too crafty, but, like, you know,
it does give you something to work with. Like, I have some chapter titles, so the pen gets moving at that point, right?
Yeah, I never had to think of chapter titles. But also, I did want The Simpsons to have a large intrusion within the book. You know, like, there are sections where Finch and Philip both talk about it specifically, and I think Finch talks about at some point in the book about how he just, like, the one sort of balking point he had with his wife was when he brought up The Simpsons and she didn't quite get what he was talking about. Right. And he has this realization that, can I really like and marry somebody who doesn't understand what I'm talking about? Like, does this show take up so much of my ideas of humor and my ideas of, like, family, that if someone doesn't get it, then maybe we're, like, too far apart, you know? And that's definitely I think when I was in my 20s, I felt that way very, very strongly. Like, I just couldn't imagine why anyone would. I felt like somebody who didn't find the early seasons of that show funny, who didn't grow up watching it, had lived such a different life and had such a different sense of humor than I did, that we would never be friends.
I know, it reminds me of a quote from Douglas Copeland, who wrote Generation X. He said the best definition of Generation X he could come up with was, if you like the Talking Heads, you're probably X. Same goes for The Simpsons and whatever we are generationally.
Yeah, and you know, it's not, and from traveling, you find that, like, it's not an American phenomenon at all. Like, I think The Simpsons is by far the most popular show in Mexico City. Like, when I was in Mexico City, it was just, like, always on, you know?
I noticed that, too, when I was there.
Yeah, and that's, like, a translation and a bad voiceover, you know? So
they're not good voice actors.
Yeah, so I feel like there is a universality of it, and I wanted that to be really, really deeply embedded in the book, and I wanted, you know, like, I always thought of the book sort of as a tribute to The Simpsons and in that sort of way, and I thought that the humor and everything, the way that Philip and Adam, his friend, talk, you know, like, it's all sort of based on conversations that they would have had 10 years earlier when they were like 19, 20 years old, when the only thing they could think to talk about was like, hey, do you remember that Simpsons where Homer did this?
Yeah, Simpsons from 1994. That's like it's your go-to, you know? Finally, I heard you on a podcast recently talking about your recent time in New York City, a few months, and you mentioned that in Los Angeles it's a much better place to be a little poorer and a little older. What does that mean?
There's definitely that quote, right? Like that New York is for like the very rich and the very poor, and then like, and goodbye to all that. I think Joan Didion says it's also a city for the very young. And I think that's true. Like, I remember when I was in graduate school in New York, and the couple of years I lived there after that, I remember there was like an energy about the city that I felt like I could process and be a part of, and I could stay up late. I could like ride the I lived on like 207th Street, but I could like get on the train from Brooklyn at 2 a.m. and just sleep, and then wake up 2 hours later and when the train stopped at my stop. And when I was back in New York this time, I just realized that I couldn't do that anymore, and that the way that people live in the city in a lot of ways and circumvent that is that they just spend a ton of money. You know, they'll just take a cab home. And I found that I was not rich enough to do that either, or like, you know, I guess like willing to part with that much money, because I don't necessarily think that everyone who does that is particularly rich. I think they just like spend more. And maybe it's like old immigrant upbringing or something like that. Like, I just found myself getting angry at how much money I was spending. So I guess it was true, and it was sad that some of the romance of the city, like, I didn't feel as much anymore. Like, I guess I just, maybe I'm too much of a curmudgeon to really get on board with sort of the literary Brooklyn movement or something like that. And I guess there's no maybe about it. I'm certainly too much of a curmudgeon to sort of believe that it's great that all these writers are living together in these neighborhoods and like going to these expensive sandwich shops.
There's a certain extent you don't want to hang out with other writers primarily, right?
Yeah, I guess I just, you know, I think that part of your task, I guess this is something that I've just found from some of the journalism I've done, and just the way that I remember myself growing up and the types of people I was drawn to, that I feel like I have a certain obligation, if I'm going to be a journalist and a writer, to hang out with people who are not media people, because media people are like thoroughly uninteresting people. I don't know if that makes sense, but they, you know, like, there's like a sort of, I guess, like within, and I think when your job is process stories, then like, and once you get past a certain point of struggle, you know, like, life can become really sort of boring. And I think that I guess, like, I've had some success with Grantland and with the book and with some magazine journalism, and I really like all that, the sort of that sense that I wasn't going to be poor and running around and having adventures anymore, and that, like, for me to sustain the level of success that however small, that I had achieved, would actually mean that I would have to sort of seek out more editors, that I would have to sort of increase my profile. Yeah, that was like, I guess that was dispiriting in a way that is different from just sort of the idea that, like, this literary society that we talked about in the beginning doesn't exist anymore. Like, that, I'm okay with that, but I guess I'm not okay with the idea that, like, being in the media and being, like, a relevant writer in some ways means that you have to, if you live in Brooklyn, I think it means that you do have to participate in the sort of economy of, you know, like, the sort of, like, whatever New York literary economy that exists right now. I guess I just, like, found that I couldn't do that, and there are a lot of great writers who I really respect who don't do that, but you know, like, they have their own, you know, like, there is, like, sort of a divide and opportunity cost that they do that with. And so I guess for me, it's just figuring out right now here in Los Angeles, like, I do feel apart from it, and, like, I can literally go anywhere and not meet a single writer. Right. And I felt where I was living in Brooklyn, I was staying at my friend's house in Cobble Hill. Like, there's no way to do that. You know, it was always in your face.
Maybe Los Angeles is an escape from the writerly life, which a writer, ironically, really needs.
Yeah, and like I said, I just think there's so much here in the city that is interesting to me that has nothing to do with Hollywood, even though I find that interesting too, that has nothing to do with this sort of like perception of Los Angeles as this garish, flat place where everybody just works out all the time. Like it just seems like there's there are more stories here than there are within like Park Slope or something like that. And I guess, I feel like it's very naive and sort of like almost dickish of me to say, but I guess I've just decided that for myself, like it's more important for me to be engaged with that and to be seeking that out here than it is for me to be in Brooklyn trying to become like more celebrated. Which, isn't happening. Maybe that's part of the reason why I was so like, I was reacting so negatively to it. Like if I was Junot Diaz and everybody wanted to hang out with me, then it would be different. Yeah.
I've been speaking with Jay Caspian Kang, editor at Grantland and author of the novel The Dead Do Not Improve. Jay, thanks so much.
Oh, thank you. That was really fun.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everyone who backed this season on Kickstarter: Danny Bolson, Brad and Laramie on Movies, Paul Doyle, Umberto Grant, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovanek, Mark Hines, Mary Gillander, Eric Graham, Will Graham, John French, Andrew Philippon Jr., Kimberly Hahn, Chris Kay, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Rebecca O'Malley, Michael O'Regan, Gail Poole, Blake Riley, Superfan Giovanni, Aidan Nullman, Adam Schaefer, Rob Schultz, Scott Schenker, Cam Smith, Kevin Smokler, Adam Sutherland, TSD, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.